Start now. Welcome, thank you for coming. We're the Platypus Affiliated Society in Cambridge. So I'll say a few words about who we are and what we do, and then I'll introduce the panel topic. I'll introduce our panelists who are over there around me, and sort of explain how the panel will go. So the Platypus Affiliated Society was established in December 2006. It organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism, focusing on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 1930s, the new 1960s, 1970s, and the post-political 1980s, 1990s left. And we do this to interrogate the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. And there's more chairs that people come in even on the side. So as part of these activities, here in Cambridge, we've had this year a reading group and coffee breaks. In London, there's a number of reading groups and coffee breaks and panels as well. For example, last autumn, we organized a panel on Enough is Enough that has just been published on our website, platypus1917.org, where you can find everything we do. You can also find a lot of what we do on our YouTube channel, and we have podcasts on Platypus Says, where you can find. So as part of these activities, Platypus Cambridge asks today, what is decolonization for the left? And here's the prompt that we sent to our panelists. Over the past few years, and particularly since the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020, decolonization has appeared as a federating catchword for radical politics in Britain and elsewhere. It appears to encompass a wide array of phenomena, forms of activism and demands, and varies considerably in different geographical contexts, making it difficult to define it. Yet to demand decolonization today necessarily points to the legacy of the sometimes drastic failures and limitations of decolonization in different historical moments. The post-World War II struggles for national self-determination, Wilsonianism, the Bolivarian Revolution, and perhaps above all, the American Revolution itself. The call for decolonization, rather than for the more traditionally leftist slogans of anti-imperialism, national self-determination, and anti-racism, also means questioning the left's and Marxism's own relationship to liberalism. Here are a few questions to guide the panelists' opening statements. What is decolonization for the left today? What are its aims, and how can they be achieved today? Second, how and why were previous phases of decolonization a failure or incomplete? What would it take to complete decolonization? What tasks have we inherited from those failures? What potential exists today for fulfilling these tasks? And how can the contemporary decolonization movement help achieve this? Third, how does decolonization relate to the task of socialism, if at all? How does it relate to other ideas, such as anti-imperialism or anti-racism? And finally, what bearing does the contemporary decolonized movement offer on previous forms of radical politics? And how might these earlier struggles judge the present? I'll introduce our three panelists. To my left, Andrew Sanchez. Andrew Sanchez grew up in a mixed race, working class household in the UK. He first became involved in leftist politics as a teenager when he started attending SWP meetings at the age of 15. In the 25 years since, he has been involved in student activism and trade unionism. As an anthropologist, he writes about the relationship between capitalism and corruption, and about race and decolonization. Further to my left, James Hartfield is a historian, most recently author of Britain's Empires, but also of the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, 1838 to 1956, a history, the Aborigines Protection Society, Humanitarian Imperialism in Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, Canada, South Africa, and the Congo, 1836 to 1909. The Bloodstained Poppy, a critique of the politics of commemoration, and Who's Afraid of the Easter Rising, 1916 to 2016, with Kevin Rooney. A long time ago, he was a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party, and today he is a regular contributor to Spike. To my right on the screen, because he couldn't come because of the rail strikes, but we're very happy to have him, Ralph Leonard. Ralph is the author of the Letters on Liberty pamphlet, Unshackling Intimacy, and he writes for Unheard, Aereo, and Sublation magazine, where he's just published an article on Max Stirner. And he appeared as a regular guest on the This is Revolution and Sublation Media podcasts. So I'll explain how this is going to work out. First, the panelists, starting the order in which I introduced them, starting with Andrew, then James, and ending with Rolf. They will each talk for 10 to 15 minutes. They will then have 5 minutes to answer each other, after which we will open the floor to a discussion. And we'll try to end around 8:30, because some of our panelists and some people in the audience have to get back to London before the trains start running. Yes. So, and we have a few people online, and so we'll also be monitoring online so we can take their questions. We are recording this event, and we are hoping to publish it on our YouTube channel, and we might transcribe it in the future, so you know. So, Andrew?
Ian, thank you. Yeah. Okay, so I strongly suspect that I have a limited capacity to say anything in this session that you probably haven't thought of before. I've been invited, so I'm going to have a crack at it anyway. Okay. So, if I think about the decolonisation projects of the mid-20th century, the way I think about them is that they are essentially incomplete political projects. They're incomplete because they did not substantively and effectively dismantle the economic, political, and intellectual structures of colonialism. And in the kind of academic jargon, the hangover of those things is called coloniality. In terms of the post-colonial economic structures, we find that most post-colonial states introduced policies of economic protectionism precisely to safeguard against post-colonial kind of economic incursion. But the effectiveness of those policies was sporadic, and the majority of the most substantial protectionist projects were really dismantled in the 1990s. In terms of political life, decolonisation, also did not dismantle the internal hierarchies and inequalities that structured colonial societies. So, as a very general statement, and it is a general statement, the ruling elites of most post-colonial societies tend to be disproportionately comprised of either classes or ethnic groups that systematically either benefited or aided colonialism. Intellectually, despite really vibrant traditions of cultural nationalism and radical thought, generally, values and ideas of colonial powers still disproportionately determine how people in post-colonial states think. They determine determinations of what matters and what's valued. And we can see that really clearly in political institutions through the ubiquity of the Westminster party political and parliamentary system, through the ways in which laws are codified, and the basic structures of education, going right down from primary education to higher education. And I think those intellectual questions are especially important right now, because the current decolonisation movement is something that I understand as a struggle for rights, but it's also fundamentally a struggle for voice and representation, which means it's a struggle about people's ability to reinterpret things and also to redefine political and economic priorities. So I'm concerned at the moment with a certain tendency in some quarters far left to dismiss the things that we call identity politics as being somehow unreal politics. And the assumption is that identity politics is unreal because it doesn't relate to things that are material economic. To me, that kind of assumption about identity politics is the type of claim that you make from a position of privilege. Because depending on who you are, your identity really might be the real politics. Your identity really might determine whether you are secure, whether you're listened to, and whether or not you have the ability to impact the world around you in ways that will be beneficial. So I understand the current decolonisation movement as a struggle for rights, but also as a struggle for the ability to imagine new political possibilities. In terms of what the left can learn from decolonisation, as Victor says, I first became involved in the far left when I was about 15. So when I was about 15, I joined the Socialist Workers' Party. I haven't been a member of that party for many, many years. Now, I was attracted to that party because I was a working class boy who grew up in a mixed race household. So some people in my family are from the Caribbean, some of them are gypsies, like Romany gypsies. So coming from that kind of background, I assumed that what the left was about was an organised struggle for social justice. And to me, it was clear that any of those struggles would necessarily be about economy and class, but it would also have to be about race and empire, and also things like gender and sexuality. So what did I do when I went to the SWP? Well, in the SWP, the first thing that I learned was tactics. And at the time I was involved in that party, the tactics that we taught young activists were how to organise and participate in demos, how to run petitions that nobody would ever read, and also how to sell copies of socialist work. I also learned about history. And in particular, I learned about the history of radical collective struggles. And I learned about those things in meetings just like this one. And at the time I was in that party, those meetings about radical history had a really particular repertoire. There were things you were supposed to know. You were supposed to know about the Paris Commune. You were supposed to know about late 1960s student revolts, the general strike, and so on. So I think that biography of being involved in the far left is probably fairly typical. So now that I think about that experience and what it was like becoming in the far left, I think that the experience was a bit problematic in a way that I couldn't have anticipated at the time. It was problematic because revolutionary socialism is supposed to be a politics of the future, but it is nonetheless a political project that has a tendency to fetishize the struggles of the past. Now, that's a really sweeping statement, and I know perfectly well not all forms of far-left politics do that. So we had a real moment in the late 2000s where the Occupy movement, the resurgence of kind of popular anarchism, was thinking about new ways of doing things. But I do think that that tendency towards anachronism is significant enough that it's a real thing. And the effect of it being a real thing is that it has a tendency to blind us to new ways of doing things. So as an anthropologist, I think I have an idea about why the far left needs a repertoire like that. I think it needs a repertoire of these kind of dramatic and heroic struggles, because frankly, being involved in the far left is a kind of a daily slog of struggle where you don't get to win very often. And actually having that repertoire of kind of, heroes and villains, it gives us all a sense that we're engaged in a historically continuous global struggle where we are not only right, but where every now and again, we sometimes actually win. So what I'm seeing at the moment, and this is just a subjective opinion, What I'm seeing at the moment is that the far left, of that kind of classic form, at least in this country, has really been overtaken by Black Lives Matter and also by movements like Me Too. Because those movements define new forms and new styles of struggle that are generally markedly more effective. So what I think the left can learn from the decolonisation movement is a willingness to be more creative and to be less bound by tactics and ideas of the past, which is a way of saying becoming progressive. In terms of what decolonisation can learn from the left, I think the focus on statues and names and symbols is important. And it's important because reforming things like this establishes the conditions that allow people to shift their perspectives on power and value. But that attention to the symbols is only worthwhile if it's then followed by a substantive change to how societies are actually organised. If it ends at the symbols, that's not a thing. That's incomplete. I also think that the current decolonisation movement should have more attention to the distinctions within the positions of different post-colonial subjects, which is a way of saying it should also think about things like class and power. So, for example, if you come from certain elite West African communities that have a huge amount of control over the political, economic, and intellectual life of your state, then you should critically consider whether or not that community has that control, because it's the type of community that profited from the slave trade. And actually those current positions of power in that society are themselves expressions of coloniality. Or, as plenty of anthropologists have pointed out, if you are a non-Indigenous Latin American, that doesn't necessarily mean that you get to go and stand up and posture as though you're a subordinate just because you write your papers in Spanish. So what I think is that the current decolonisation needs to not only know and recognise those things, it has to have a sincere commitment to substantively dismantling. Finally, and here I'm going to repeat myself, repeating something that I've written about, but presumably that's why you invited me, so I think it's all right. Finally, I think the decolonisation movement should have more attention to understanding the neo-colonial terms of its own project. And in particular, what I'm talking about is the fact that that global project is overwhelmingly, but not exclusively, comprised of North American reference points. So, for example, Black Lives Matter has genuinely sparked a global reckoning with questions of racial power, which to me means that it's fundamentally a good thing and it's effective. But the question it raises to me is, why was that spark the thing that started the fire and not something else? So the global left, and I'm assuming you might be the left, the global left could have been inspired to that reckoning with race at any point of the previous generations by being collectively outraged by things like caste injustice in India, which involves hundreds of millions of people. But they weren't. People didn't care enough. Or the global left could have been outraged by the fact that gypsies all across Europe have been enslaved and murdered and sterilised and imprisoned for hundreds and hundreds of years. Frankly, they weren't, and they didn't care. Now, the uncomfortable fact is that issues like that were of great interest to the people they directly affected. They were of interest to specialists that studied them. But other people didn't care enough to be motivated by them in the way that Black Lives Matter has inspired people to act. So the general point that I want to end on is that I think decolonisation on the left has to start confronting the fact that we've been presented with a case study that shows us that US issues and US politics have the capacity to become global issues in a way that issues in other parts of the world don't. That's a contradiction to me, because I regard the US, among other places, as being a de facto neo-colonial power. And I think of the US as being a neo-colonial power because it has an undue level of kind of power and authority over other nations, ways of thought, their economy, their politics, and even through the exercise of violence. So, yeah, that's me, 14 minutes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. James, go ahead.
Oh, hi, and thank you for that brilliant introduction. And thanks for inviting me. It's lovely to be here. And thank you for coming along and listening. And I want to, so I've got how many things I want to say about 2.5. I suppose I'd say, first off, I'm listening to my esteemed colleague, and I think maybe I don't want to make it like into semantic, but I've written histories of the British Empire, and I feel that I want to use the words colonialism in a more prosaic, like obvious way. I mean, I think I'm familiar with the argument about neo-colonialism, but I think it helps really to see colonialism is a historically bounded event, and it's over. The colonialism is over in the strict meaning of the word. I know you can extend the meaning of the word, but if you do so, then know that you're extending the meaning of the word. What I mean to say is that substantially what we're talking about is, speaking as an historian, is European colonies, European empires, which shared out the most of the world in two massive waves. One at the around the 1700, and the other around 1880 through to 1945, and it's pointedly been dismantled. In a period really from from the end of the Second World War, but that took got its particular pace in the 1960s. Dribbled on in the British case, I suppose, with the colony of the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. But I'm not sure that even you could speak of the colony of the 6 counties of Northern Ireland after the Good Friday Agreement. And after the referenda in the 26 counties on the Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution, in the sense that there isn't a national claim that's clear contestation for power. I think we've got a mixed authority. Britain is incapable of governing in Northern Ireland. That's why they incorporate the South and the European Union. And the South doesn't really want the 6 counties, which I think is what the Articles 2 and 3 mean. Sinn Féin is the biggest party. It's a fascinating time, but what it isn't, I think you can see from the massive decrease in violence following the Good Friday Agreement. It's not an anti-colonial struggle in the ordinary sense. And that was kind of where I was politically, because that was what electrified me in politics. It was the fact that there was this anti-colonial struggle within the borders of the United Kingdom. And it was what got me writing. But I think, so I want to say, I do understand the point that because, we all read Kwame Nkrumah's book about neocolonialism, where he makes this really excellent point, which is that, like you said, seek ye first the political kingdom. He said, free yourself politically and take political authority in your countries and take it from the imperialists. And then he said, and he was influenced by other people that had alerted this point, like James Conway. he said, you know, look, if they still control us through economy and what have you, then we're not really through, and there's still a struggle to fight. So, and which is a reasonable point. But I think by now you can basically say, well, colonialism, anti-colonialism, and here I disagree, was a massive success. You know, the colonies are gone, the flags are down, the armies have left for the most part, the countries are independent. They have problems, and this, as I think, is a kind of misunderstanding. Did anybody ever think that they would not? I mean, did anybody think that the end of colonialism would mean the end of capitalism and oppression and all the rest of it? No, they just meant that it would mean that the British or the French or the Dutch would be out, and that the people would be in a position to address their own problems. And I think now, if you're living in India or in Nigeria, places like that, I think you'd have to say decolonisation was the most amazing success story. It was the most amazing success story. Nearly half the people on the planet now live in places where they have freed themselves from colonial rule. And to dismiss that and not to understand that life that they made, that life they have made, is their life, and to say it's not, it doesn't count, you are unfree, you're not responsible, is debilitating. It's debilitating not to understand that the struggles of the people in India, I mean, I've no big idea about any of those, I want to say, or, you know, what confronts people in Jamaica, or what confronts people in Ireland. I have literally no good advice, because they're not my problems. They're their problems. That's what it means to be independent. And I think that's one thing. I want to say colonialism is over. Now, I think I try not to be rude, but I do think there's something kind of weird about talking about our contemporary discussions about statues and books and histories and all that, and to preface it with decolonisation. You know, sure, let's have a conversation about, you know, whose statue should be up, or, you know, what books you should read. But let's not call that decolonisation, because decolonisation was a shooting war. You know, it was a massive social conflict. And it's trivialising to say the conversations that we're now having about the curricula, or about what books we should read, that we think that is somehow an extension of the decolonisation struggle. They're interesting academic discussions, but they're not a decolonisation struggle. That, I think, is verging on the childish. And I want to say as well that it's wrong in a sense, because you know, if you read closely the works of you know, like Robbie Shillian or Bambra, or all the you know, the Homi Bhabha, all the people that you should be reading if you're reading the decolonial, post-colonial literature, you're not really reading about the developed world and its particular problems. What you're really reading is a species of postmodern philosophy. That's the actual wellsprings of decolonial literature. It's an extension of, you know, people are reading Heidegger, and they're reading Carl Schmitt, and after, and I was there, by the way, you know, when they were at college reading those things, people started to tap them on the shoulder and say, you know, you stuck up twats, he used to say. Sorry, they used to say, oh, please, you know, you're going to talk to me about Lyotard. That is so embarrassing. You know, what is that about? And they would say, oh, yeah, God, right. You know, I mean, you know, let's deconstruct the narrative. It was so kind of like, they used to call them the theory boys. It was kind of embarrassing that, you know, there was all this intense activity. So quickly, they thought, oh, you know, let's try and dress this up in drag. You know, let's kind of attach this to some kind of big social struggle that will make it sound grand and less ridiculous. And so, well, happily, Edward Said was there, who was like the crossover point, and Gayatri Spivak, and they were there, and they kind of lent all this postmodern deconstruction of the grand narrative, the clothes of some kind of social struggle. They said, no, we're not just messing about with rationality and writing out particular critique of rationality. We're doing real work here, where Decol is an extension of the work that Nkrumah and Fanon did. You know, we're doing the work here where we're going to. It's the same thing, comrade. Don't you understand? Not what you were fighting back then. You were fighting against the British Empire. We're fighting against the British Empire in the library. You know, we're going to take over the oppressive power of the Western rationality. Not the Western machine guns or the Western tanks, but the oppressive power of Descartes, you know, down with Descartes. This is completely useless to anybody in the developing world or the developed. And also it's thoroughly Western. I want to say this is bog standard end of the 20th century, end of history, social philosophy masquerading as decolonisation. That was it.
Nothing very much. All right, well, it's your turn.
All right.
Let's make sure we can hear you and that you can hear us.
I can hear you.
Go ahead. Yes, we can hear you too.
Okay. I think it'll be hard for me to follow up in the path of the two previous speakers with their very cogent remarks on this very interesting subject. And hopefully I don't sound too much like a cyborg across the screen. But anyways, look, this the idea of decolonization has become a bit of a fad in Western discourse in the past decade, especially since 2020, when protesters in the wake of the killing of George Floyd in the United States believed that taking down statues was a radical act of decolonization, that finally, in this moment, the Occident would face a reckoning with its history, centuries-long history of violence, of colonialism against subaltern peoples. Now, of course, decolonization once denoted the political movement for national liberation that engulfed Africa and Asia in the mid-20th century, demanding national independence from European tutelage, where the nation-state model will be truly universalized across the world in place of the world of empires that preceded it. But in the 21st century, decolonization increasingly denotes a primarily academic and cultural tendency, influenced by the decolonial turn promoted by thinkers such as Walter Mignolo and Ramon Grosfugal, which takes aim at the supposed universality of Western knowledge as this, and how it's an instrument of the colonial matrix of power. The dependency theorists of the 1960s wanted the third world to de-link economically and politically from the global system. But likewise, the decolonizers of today seek for marginalized groups to de-link intellectually and epistemically from the Western tradition that has been vaunted for much too long. In essence, according to decolonial theory, the completion of the struggle against Western imperialism necessitates a rejection of the Western Weltanschauung due to its supposed inherent coloniality. Hence, decolonize the curriculum, decolonize the museum by returning the Benin bronzes. As with any zany cultural radicalisms, an entire cottage industry is created around it, where anything and everything must be decolonized. It's symptomatic of how easily capitalist culture can assimilate ostensibly anti-capitalist memes into its modus vivendi. Olufemi Taiwo, a Nigerian academic, in his cogent critique of decolonial theory in Against Decolonization, decried it as harming scholarship on Africa, but also for its full embrace of the racialization of consciousness, as if modernity was in some intrinsic way anti-Black, a position that relegates Africans to merely being victims or resistors of modernity rather than agents within it or appropriators of it. In Taiwo's words, it turns Africans into permanent subalterns within their own history. Decolonial theory presumes that so-called people of color or the colonized have no connection with Western universality, that has no relevance to them, that to be properly radical is to be disenchanted with all that is designated as Western, that they can only justify themselves or critique capitalism from the basis of a pre-modern or pre-capitalist, localized, autochthonous identity standpoint, whose thought must be purified of Western influence, lest they remain subservient and thus alienated from themselves. In contrast to this decolonial particularism, consider the universality of Frantz Fanon, often, in my opinion, abused by decolonizers of today, who said in The Wretched of the Earth that all elements of a solution to the great problems of humanity have at different times existed in European thought. Or C.L.R. James, who said that I denounce European colonialism, but I respect the learning and profound discoveries of Western civilization. Both of these statements could be lambasted as Eurocentric, but that would be to misunderstand them. They weren't paeans to the intrinsic greatness of Europe. Rather, it was a recognition of the fact that a universal social form that happened to fertilize in Europe from the Renaissance onwards and spread outwards throughout the world, what we now call bourgeois society, had surpassed all previous social formations, and within it held the keys to the universal emancipation of humanity. Their commitment to world revolution, as opposed to the mere decolonization of the mind, was rooted in the unequivocal observation that the basis of international socialism lay in what Marx had once designated the civilizing effects of capital, its drive to universality beyond national borders through trade and the world market, the antagonistic cooperation of nations and peoples through immigration and the international division of labor. Communism, this form of communism, may seem passé to the theoreticians of decoloniality, but its historical program was far more profound and radical, precluding any talk of return to culture, repatriation, or strategic essentialism. Race, like nation, and the patriarchy will be thrown to the rubbish bin of history once and for all, realizing the potential imminent within bourgeois society of a world without races, fatherlands, where the accumulated cultural patrimony of civilization will belong to all without the need for a claim of exclusive ownership through ancestry. Let me quote a passage from Frantz Fanon's Black Skins, White Masks that exemplifies this radical universalism. You could perhaps call this true decolonization, where he says, I am a man and I have to rework the world's past from the very beginning. I am not responsible for the slave revolt of Saint-Domingue, the Haitian Revolution. Every time a man has brought victory to the dignity of the spirit, every time a man has said no to enslave his fellow man, I've felt a sense of solidarity with this act. In no way does my basic vocation have to be drawn from the past of peoples of color. I'm not a slave to the slavery that dehumanized my ancestors. For many Black intellectuals, European civilization possesses a characteristic of exteriority. In human relationships, the Western world can feel foreign to a Black man, not one to be thought of as a poor relation, an adopted son, or bastard child. he must feverishly try to discover a Black civilization. Let there be no misunderstanding. We are convinced it would be of enormous interest to discover Black literature or architecture from the 3rd century before Christ. Would be overjoyed to learn of the existence of a correspondence between a Black philosopher and Plato, but we can absolutely not see how this fact would change the lives of 8-year-old kids who work in the cane fields of Martinique or Guadeloupe. The prevalence of decolonial theory clearly stems from the failures of the national liberation movements, where the nation-state model became not an avenue of liberation and autonomy, but became an avenue of oppression and reproduced more divisions, whether ethnic or sectarian. And in turn, these historical failures came from the defeat of socialism, which had represented this progressive, futuristic, internationalist movement to overcome capitalist imperialism. Because movements have failed to defeat the West politically, it's now believed that one can defeat Western imperialism in the realm of thought and epistemology. This is folly, in my opinion, vulgar idealism, and just reactionary. If socialism or any movement to overcome the contradictions of capital are to be revived as a real movement of history, it won't be served by decolonial theory. You can't critique capitalism from some indigenous or pre-capitalist identity. It will come from a negation of these things. To quote the famous words of Goethe's Faust, all that exists deserves to perish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. So now each of the panelists will have 5 minutes to respond to what you just heard, perhaps ask questions to each other. And after that, we can move on to the Q&A. So in the order in which the presenter. So Andrew, if you want to start.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, thanks, guys. I don't know if you can see that I'm looking at you, but I am looking at you.
I can see.
Okay. Let me think. Right. So I think contemporary decolonisation, the political project, it has the capacity to be co-opted in basically performative ways. It has the capacity to be a fad and to be kind of intellectualist without any kind of, clear application. But that doesn't mean the essential terms of the project are essentially wrong. Okay? And you're probably kind of raising these issues to the wrong person, because I'm an anthropologist and a professional academic. And that means I assume that culture and ideas matter. Now, I'm also a kind of, somewhat anachronistic Marxist. So I think that kind of, like class and power and violence matter, but culture and ideas matter too. Now, in terms of the place of culture and ideas in establishing the conditions for radical struggle and the types of struggles that you two are talking about, which are people going out into the street with kind of guns and machetes and things like that, I think I'm in pretty good company with like most radical thinkers and actually most kind of, to be anachronistic again, vanguard socialists in believing that ideas matter. Now, in terms of like whether or not that's a project of simply taking things away and removing good thought from the world, no, it isn't. When people talk about things like decolonising the curriculum, I'm certain that there's a reasonable number of people who are talking about it in a slightly simplistic way, which is just about taking a few things off a reading list. But not necessarily. When I use terms like that, I'm saying something really, really simple. What I'm saying is I want to have a bit more space in my head and in my students' head for a wider range of things that we've never thought of before. And to me, that's just fundamentally reasonable and fundamentally productive. And, it's a matter of taste, but I really do think thinking about things helps you to imagine how to make things better. So this kind of distinction between the material and the ideological that in itself is an ideology. In terms of whether or not kind of colonialism is done and dusted, no, it isn't. Okay? So in a very kind of strict formal sense, we can clearly date the dismantling of colonial states to specific moments and times, clearly. But if the thing that we call coloniality wasn't a real thing, then I wouldn't be able to very clearly look at the world and see that the majority of post-colonial states are made up of people whose lives are shorter and sicker and poorer than my life. Those facts are slapping us in the face every single day. And acknowledging those facts isn't a project of kind of dismissing the efforts and the struggles and the victories of the anti-colonial movement. I have absolute respect for those movements, and they were effective in some ways. But I can't just sit there and say, do you know what? We got this fixed, it's done. It's not done. If it was done, the world would not be so absolutely, disgracefully, unjustly unequal. And it's not incidental that it happens to be unequal along the same lines the colonizer and colonized, right? So if colonialism was done, we wouldn't be in this situation. Okay.
Thanks, Andrew. James?
I mean, look, you started with reaching out and you kind of pull back a bit. I say yes, absolutely, ideas matter, and my daughter's just gone through her English literature degree, and I love all the tweaking that goes on. I mean, there is only so much really in the curriculum, but obviously there's to broaden it out, it's all a great thing, and we should of course enjoy the riches of the human culture and civilization, which is vast, and English literature is a tiny part, and that's all to the good. So I can agree with that. I didn't think I was saying that it's. I mean, maybe I slipped into that rhetoric. That I believe in the real struggle, you believe in the ideas. But I was really trying to illustrate the difference, which I think I did underline it because I meant to, which is that there was there was a succession of real national struggles of independence, and they're of a different order. I don't even think they're the same thing. I'm not saying this isn't to say that to reassess history or literature or culture is not important. I'm not saying that, but I don't think they're the same thing. They're just different struggles. We're in a different moment. We're talking different things. Maybe we're just growing up a bit. Maybe our civilization is becoming more intelligent and less prickly and defensive, and can absorb more and can react and respond. We can hear the kind of crass things that we used to say, and flinch a bit from that. But people in the future will be laughing at us and mocking all of our kind of short judgments, and they'll view with contempt lots of things we feel absolutely certain of. I feel sure because I know that that's happening to us right now, and we'll be surprised. But I think that on the you ended with a good point on inequality. It reminded me of the work of Samir Amin in what were they called, the school of the I forgot the name of the school. Dependency theory, yeah, and under whatever it was, and the whole thing, the thesis, and Samir used to bring out a book every year saying, capitalism's never going to take off in Korea, and that it was wrong. And then he would say, capitalism's never going to take off from China, and that was wrong. And I knew why he was saying it. He was saying that the coordinates of the past of the dominant West and the subordinate East and South were reproduced, and they were. There's no doubt that it was right in the broad sense. That's how capitalism works, isn't it? People with the money tend to get more money. People without the money tend to get less, because without the money, you don't have the means to get the more money. With the more money, you tend to have the means to get more money. It does have that character. But it's also that there is a blindness, and there's a blindness in Nkrumah's in the dependency theory and the under development thesis, which is that it doesn't understand that the world is dramatically dynamic, and that we were really thinking that the end of communism would mean China would become a colony. That was kind of where we were with looking at, that's how it looked to lots of us. In 1990, we really thought, they're going to recolonize China. And now you think, got that wrong. Because China's, I know lots of people hate this, and they go, China. But I'm thinking this is a fabulous thing. It's superb what, but I've been reading about, China's development project in Laos, and you think about what the West did to Laos, completely destroyed the whole place. It was the most bombed place in the entire world. And it seems mundane, maybe to build roads and railways, but actually that's human civilization, isn't it, right there? So I think there's, I hate the fact that the politics there are so kind of controlled and everything, but this is a center of human ingenuity, which is going to dominate the 21st century. And we all ought to be thinking about how to negotiate. And again, Europe definitely was like the the demon of the monster of the 19th century. But Europe now, is it as important? It's a kind of ramshackle place that it's always, they always keep going, we don't have war in Europe, and then they do. There's always a war in Europe. Lately, just slightly off. It's not really Europe. East Europe doesn't count, that kind of thing. So I just think, and America is. I love America. I want to say I love America. It's a fabulous place. Honestly, do you think like everything that you love really comes out? So many superb things come out of America. Lots of horrible things come out. It's what you listen to, what you go to watch. Cinema and what you serve. Everything is American, I think, because it's good. Because there's 300 million people thinking and working and doing terrible things to each other and everybody else as well. But I do think maybe America's not the 21st century. But when you see like West Coast, So there is a dynamism, and I never thought that the end of colonialism would mean the end of inequality. But and like I say, I really rhetorically I wanted to make that work. I want to say no, they're not really free. Those countries aren't. They're still dominated by capitalism. Well, sure, that's the problem. Capitalism is the problem, but you can't address those. You can't address the weaknesses of the elites in Nigeria today. Or in South Africa, if you're still stuck in that colonial rhetoric. And whenever I meet people who are like sharp and radical in the those different parts of the world, but they're not talking to. I remember this, like lots of Irish people were saying to me, Chuck Yala, and they were bored, they were and repressed. They felt constrained by republicanism. It was a dead end. I think it did. It's tremendously important contribution to history, but that's not where the future's come from. Sinn Féin is doing well, but it's really. I've talked too much.
Thank you, James. Ralph.
As for the question whether colonialism is still like existing now in our world or not, like I remember when I first became politically conscious, and one of the issues that made me politically conscious was the question of Palestine. And if you engage with that issue, this debate comes up. Is it, an issue of settler colonialism often? Because that's how Zionism is often interpreted, as a settler colonial project in the Middle East. Yeah, but then on the other side, like, Zionists will say, well, we are a national liberation project. And then you find this clash between these two ideas. And in a way, you could say it's both. It's both. That it's both a project of national liberation and nation building, but the result of that nation building meant, a kind of settler colonial project that, extirpated or moved away the Palestinian Arabs. And also another thing about this decolonial issue is if you engage with like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and a lot of if you read a lot of Ukrainian like intellectuals or just the Ukrainian public, some of their rhetoric is often framed as in this decolonizing rhetoric, because a lot of what Russia's done is in the parts of Ukraine they occupy is imposed the Russian language, trashed a lot of Ukrainian cultural artifacts, kidnapped Ukrainian children and sort of assimilated them, like Russified them, which was something that's been done in the past, and it's kind of reminiscent of what happened in Canada with indigenous children, or even with the Nazis, what they did with Polish children, kidnap them and make them Germans. So you will find like little parallels with this stuff, but I do think that overall, if we're talking about capitalism today, I'm not sure like the colonial frame will be the best way to truly understand capitalism in its totality. Maybe a fragment of it, but not in its totality.
Thank you very much, Rolf. So we'll now open up to the floor. I'll be taking questions, one question at a time, and then all three panelists have a chance to answer. I'll try to make sure, because Ralph isn't in the room, it's a bit, I'll make sure he gets a chance to answer. And Camille will make sure that if there's questions in the chat from our friends watching from afar, that they're also taken. So who has a question first? Just raise your hand to have a sense. I'll just start with Mateusz just here.
Great. Thank you very much. It was great to hear you speak. Just listening to you talk about the decolonial struggle in the 20th century and now dragging onto the 21st century, it really reminds me of the 1848 moment, Spring of the Peoples, where sovereign nations in Europe were raising up against, Austro-Hungarian Empire and against all those bigger European entities in a struggle for national independence. And the struggle for national independence was not against, it was conceived, the nation was conceived as the people, the sovereign, that have the right to constitute their own laws and have the right to establish civil society and so on. And that was juxtaposed and opposed to the cosmopolitan, royal, traditional, feudal elites that were ruled. So nation was juxtaposed. So nation was this bourgeois new concept that was juxtaposed to those ideas. And the 20th century decolonial struggle really seems like however, those nation states which were created after 1848 it quickly came out that actually the nation states fell in conflicts with one another, again, even if they were within those frameworks, right? And gave rise to petty, conservative, reactionary nationalism that just are trying to fight their way within the wider capitalist system. So it really, the way we talk about the decolonial struggle in the 20th century, it makes me wonder, aren't we naturalizing the nation state framework for it, right? Isn't the Nigerian state or the Rwandan state or the Dominican state, any of those countries, really, are they in any way the kind of the same sovereign that they're speaking for the people, or are we missing here the wider international context of that and the wider struggle? So my question is, first of all, about the nation state, and really whether that's an adequate framework. And when we discuss it, it's just like, oh, US is exploiting Vietnam and Vietnamese consumers should have more. But really, like, does the Vietnamese state and Vietnamese elites stand for the Vietnamese people at large? Just second point I wanted to raise, it drew my attention that it was framed as the left should be outraged at the caste system in India. And I think it really points to a wider impotence of the left, right? Because what does it mean for the left to be outraged? Yeah. In the words of Kołakowski, who we read at Platypus, it's bleeding heartism is not a political position. And I wonder what kind of political position could emerge out of such outrage at those at caste system in India or racial discrimination in the United States. Thank you.
Thanks. Whoever wants to speak first. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, like, on outrage, I think outrage on its own is not kind of, a productive political force. And outrage on its own can be kind of performative and just destructive. But outrage against injustice can be the most important initial step to then doing something, right? So to kind of come back to the example that Victor opened with, the prompt, the Black Lives Matter movement, that was a movement organized around outrage. And it's a movement which, I might be being kind of naively hopeful here. I think it does have the capacity to have an actual impact on how policing is done, right? So that's what I think. In terms of nations, is the nation state a kind of a reductive or kind of limiting concept? Yeah, it is. I agree. I think the world is a lot more complex than nations and nation states. But then there's also the kind of the interesting tension here, which is that nationalism was also very important to kind of anti-colonial struggle. So, part of Chatterjee, like the Indian kind of theorist, has written about this kind of really well. The idea that there are national identities in places like, India, Jamaica, Nigeria, and so forth, that was a motivating principle that gave people things to organise around. Yeah.
Thanks. James, Charles?
So I like the last point. I mean, I think liberal people often try to think beyond the nation state, but somehow it keeps coming back. And I think it's compelling that even in the language of internationalism, you mean nationalism. The internationalism, it doesn't abolish nationalism. This might be a logical point, but you're talking internationalism, to my mind, meant solidarity with people in other places, fighting for their freedom. It meant to acknowledge the national rights of the Irish, the national rights of South Africans, Black South Africans, who agree with their system. So internationalism to me it did mean kind of recognizing national rights, and it didn't free from it. I don't think it ever worked. I don't think that kind of Bolshevik ideal of international guy. I remember seeing years ago Theodore Shannon saying this. Said for about it was about 5 years between 1917 and 1923, when guys used to go about in leather jackets and bald heads, and they really believed that they were the partisans of the future, that were going to leave the nation state behind it with the new men. But somehow it recurs, and I think now maybe I got more respect maybe for Hannah Arendt's view that world government is kind of a nonsensical position, that world government's so vast that no person could have a control of it, and you got more prospect of and maybe here I think that I've got a difference maybe with a kind of platypus view, which is that you can't escape. Political power has a national form, and if you want political authority, you have to address the national form that authority is distributed within.
Thanks, James. Ralph?
This is the paradox of nationalism, because at least in its origins with the American War of Independence and the French Revolution, it had a progressive, even unifying power, because that was what nationalism originally was. It was unifying different peoples, principalities, provinces in the service of a common political project and vision. And that was also the dream in the anti-colonial movement, that in Nigeria you won't be Yoruba or Igbo or Hausa, you'd be Nigerians, citizens of this common republic. But unfortunately, in the colonial world, that kind of slightly utopian, vision of nationalism has gone away, and it's sort of seen as just a kind of social Darwinist struggle between ethnic groups and sexes, like my tribe versus your tribe, and even compared to that identity politics, the nation seems like quite progressive compared to that. But I would also say that the nation did serve a necessary stage in human development, but I wouldn't say it's the end point. But the problem is how do you transcend the nation? And that's my guess is as good as yours, and that's a very difficult subject to broach.
Thanks. More questions? Okay, yes.
Hi, thanks so much for a really, really interesting panel. I feel like I've been to a lot of panels where all the panelists just agree with each other. It's much more sort of interesting and useful. I have a question that came to my mind when I was listening to James's opening, but I think the other panelists might also have something to say on it. That's to do with, as Andrew noted, there's still these manifest inequalities and injustices that we can see, pretty much align with, former colonies and colonizers, and, these relations of domination and extraction and so forth between the sort of global north and south. And that it's not just sort of, reading lists that we're talking about here. And I think for me to be convinced that, throwing out decolonization as a useful term, or that it's useful to just say that, it's all over, I'd like to hear a bit more about, how then do we look at these, injustices and inequalities? What is sort of, productive about, throwing out these concepts? What are they stopping us from seeing, and what can we then see more clearly once we stop, fussing over, decolonization and so forth?
Thanks. And it's more clearly addressed to James, but if Andrew and Ralph want to answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think I suppose the simple point is this, and it was always understood, I think, within the anti-colonial struggles, was that the great advantage of getting the the occupying nation off your back in its political domination was that it'd be clear, you'd be in a better position then to see the inequalities within your own society. So when people were, and it was always the case that the colonial authorities didn't really, it was never like, Britain ruled India. I mean, that was the absolute political apex, that was true. But, most Indians never met a white person throughout, for sort of 300 years of Britain in India. It was like, there were local elites. There were the local elites that, and in part had been encouraged by and fostered by, but, and negotiated relationships with them. And, my own work, I've often come, I spent some time in Fiji talking about the little war with people. And I was corrected intelligently by a Fijian chief who made the point to me. He said, you think it was Governor Gordon organised this war against the upland Fijians. He says, that was us. He said, we fought war against the hill folk, the Teboro, and we got you to give us guns. So and that was how he saw it, and it was a great correction because with my post-colonial glasses, I could only see the European angle, and he was saying to me, obviously we've got ambitions here, and we wanted to modernise. We wanted to screw those guys up the hill, and make them all go to church like us, and so they'd be civilised. And obviously there's a whole mess of things going on there. But Fiji's a great example. Struggled ever since to cope with how do they get out of their colonial setup, which is manifested in a very fractious racial divide in the country between Indo-Fijians and Fijians, and it's been a curse. I had to get out from under that. But the way to get out from under them, I think, that people have found again and again, is to start thinking Fijian. Stop thinking, we've been hard done by. Start thinking we're defeating each other. We need to sort this out. So I do think that it's arresting and debilitating. I think it's intellectually and morally debilitating to refer up. To refer back to, the way that ZANU PF did in Zimbabwe. Really, I think that it was very destructive, the way that they constantly arrested social development within Zimbabwe by forcing it back into the prism of a colonial era struggle in a way that really was a barrier to social development in the country.
Thanks, James. Ralph, do you want to add something? Andrew, do you want to add something to this?
I'll just piggyback on that point by saying that we also have to be careful not to validate colonial propaganda too much and give the white man the power of God, as if he has complete agency and other people don't, especially now in the post-colonial era, that people within these nations and societies do have agency. They have at least the potential to change their own conditions. And I think any radical project, however it may be conceived, must make people realize that they do have this power and help them to exercise it for their own benefit. Yeah.
Great. Thanks. Further questions? Jack?
All right. I just want to circle back to the first question about the concept of decolonization, rather affirming the bourgeois idea of a nation state, and also drawing some things that the various panelists said. So if the left is a movement to affirm the bourgeois rights and ideals of all peoples on this earth equally, what separates the left from liberalism? And if that is not the case, if the left is focused on the idea of the transformation of society and the achievement of socialism, then why should the left care about decolonization beyond transforming it into a movement for socialism? Or care or organize, I guess.
Thank you. I guess it's all three. Andrew, if you want to begin.
I think it's a really, really good question. So the answer I'm going to give you is going to be, sincere. It's what I really think. But it's probably going to come across as sounding kind of glib, and it's not intended to. There isn't like a glib kind of motivation behind it. My personal position is that I don't mind if that aspect of socialism sounds like liberalism. Because for a really, really long time, I genuinely did think about political life as essentially kind of, a fight where you pick a side and you get stuck in and you just fight to the death. And it's a terminal fight. You never admit you're wrong. Whoever's on your side, doesn't matter what they do, they're always on your side. I kind of don't really think that, right? So I think that there are aspects of kind of the socialist project that are about striving for people's rights and striving for justice. Presumably, that's part of the liberal project too. But it doesn't mean that that doesn't negate socialism. And it also doesn't fully rehabilitate liberalism either. Right? So for me, these things, and you haven't implied this as you said, right? But for me, these things, they're not cults, right? They're a series of ideas about the world that are supposed to be giving us kind of, useful tools for understanding it. If you understand it well enough, you can do something with the understanding. So that's my position. Yeah, but it's a good question.
Thanks, Andrew. Ralph, James?
Yeah, I agree.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it like this: is that rights as an issue is always turned on its head every time you change the parameter who has the rights. You can read the poems of John Wilmot, the Libertine, Marquis de Sade, and you can glory in their kind of chaotic and obscene freedom that they asserted. But you're always a bit kind of upset that it involves spanking other people who didn't really get a choice, and lots of sybaritic pleasures at the expense of everybody else. But when other people claim those rights, and they pull them out, and they become transformed, in the same way you can love Aristotle and Plato and all these people. This kind of irks you that there's all these slaves working away, picking the grapes so that they can, enjoy it and all the rest of it. And when they kind of pull them out, it turns it into something magically other, So it doesn't seem to me like a bad thing that Thomas Sankara said it, where he said, the French Revolution showed us the idea of freedom, and the Bolshevik Revolution showed us the actuality. And then what he meant was, and therefore I'm going to get involved in the national struggle in Ghana, which might seem a small, oh wow, France, Russia, Ghana, but it's more like. Beg your pardon. What I mean to say is that it's the when you turn the national struggle of European powers into the national struggle of post-colonial powers, that's a whole new chapter of freedom that's opening up, which is, whereas it's become a bit hackneyed in Italy and Piedmont, I think it got this magic new drama in that post-colonial struggle, which gave it a real meaning. I mean, but like lots of things, the drama is finished, and you're in South Africa now. You think, was this what we fought for? And maybe not, but now you can confront the problems of your day, because that's how you make these struggles.
Thanks, James. Ralph?
I was going to say, socialism is imminent to liberalism. It doesn't exist in some alien location outside of it. Socialism exists because liberalism and bourgeois society overall came into its own self-contradiction within capitalism. So liberal society betrays itself, while socialists seek to, apply the principles of liberté, égalité, fraternity to its logical conclusion. Yeah, that's all I'll say.
Thanks, Bob. Questions? And people online on Zoom can also ask questions. We're monitoring. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for your old course so far. We got a question of statements that James made, but I'm happy to have others speak as well. So you said that colonialism is over in the historic sense of the word, but doesn't it hurt for decolonization to have a historically bounded understanding of colonialism, considering so many of our lives are still governed by laws that were set in stone by colonial powers? And I mean, to think that colonialism is a historically bounded phenomenon and decolonization was a historical movement, it's also, these understandings are also a brainchild of neoliberal and ironically neo-colonial institutions who ask us to accept such understandings of colonialism. And my second question is, you said that we can't address problems if we are stuck in colonialism, but why should we not be stuck in colonialism? Especially because, like I said, we still live in spaces and among people, we live on the basis of caste and class privilege, on the basis of racial privilege, gender privilege. And so moving on from empire is the answer to what problem? And so why shouldn't we demand answers of what was done to our people? And if asking for acknowledgement of crimes committed against colonized and enslaved people as being stuck in colonialism, I know a few millions who would agree with being stuck in that sort of colonial problem situation. Thank you.
Thanks. It was addressed to James, but again, it's open to anyone. But James, maybe.
Yeah, no, thank you. You put it well, and you put me on the spot, and I'm grateful. I suppose the way I look at this in terms of how the world works, in my view, that it's the present, and this is going to sound unnecessarily contentious, it's the present that makes the past more than the past that makes the present. What I mean to say is that there's not an atom of the British Empire left. We're in this world that we are, but we can choose. We can choose to recreate those patterns of oppression and what have you, because an exploitation, and we do. This what you're describing is that the modern world needs inequality. It's this is the foundation of the profits and surplus value and all the rest of it, and it receives from the past all these different boundaries and structures, but substantially they're made in the present. And to the extent to which, and it's not that what I'm trying to say, I know this is going to sound unduly kind of philosophical, kind of sneak answer maybe, but I don't see it as like, it's not as if the past is imposing upon us and making us do these things. It's much more that we here in the present are reinventing the past all the time to dominate us and to do it. That's what we should undo. I'm not saying there isn't inequality. I'm not saying that there isn't injustice or class society or indeed a great inequality between national powers. In fact, I spent a lot of time writing about those things. But when you say like the laws are set in stone, quite literally, they're not. The laws, in the nature of laws, are they might be inscribed in stone, but they're not made of stone. They're made of human relations. What if in different parts of the former British Empire we have oppressive laws, maybe on sexuality or on property or on all those things. Those things exist now, insofar as the people in those countries let them exist. It's not Britain. It's not Britain that is making all the oppressive laws that we've gifted on sodomy exists. In fact, the British Foreign Office is rather sneakily, goes around telling people, oh no, don't go to Saudi Arabia because they've got very backward laws on those things, forgetting that we put them there. But which is obviously gravely dishonest on their part, but also it's kind of, you can't really say that Britain is not the country that's making Saudi have those oppressive laws. Saudi Arabia is the country that's making that country have those oppressive laws. So until the Saudis and the subject peoples within Saudi Arabia confront the elite there, those laws aren't going to change. But I mean, what would it mean if Britain was to impose, if in Britain, would you, from Britain, you could make some prospect of democratizing those countries? I don't think that. It's got to be addressed within the countries themselves.
We're selling them the arms, aren't we?
Oh yeah, look, I'm not, and that is despicable. Absolutely, we should be, raise that by all means. Yeah, not against that.
Andrew, Ralph, did you want to add something? Or respond to what James just said?
No, I'm fine.
All right. There was a question over there. Becca?
Hi, everyone. So there is this, and maybe it's getting at this issue of was decolonization, was not decolonization? How do we address problems in society? What's actually the issue that the left is encountering to transform society towards something new, something more equitable, towards new possibilities of freedom. And I think it comes to whether coloniality is the deeper problem or capitalism is the deeper problem, right? Is capitalism a coloniality problem or is colonization a capitalism problem? And I want to kind of use something that Ralph said, and maybe that James said as well to kind of frame this. Ralph was saying that the way that we experience decolonization, or that the left uses decolonization as a politics, is a result of the failure of the the movements for self-determination, which is itself a failure of the earlier socialist and communist revolutions in the early 20th century, right? So there's this kind of, so that's kind of the problem there. The horizons of politics there is capitalism as an international problem, and the left's successive failures to address that problem. So it turns into something else. And James said something kind of similar. Okay, right, with this idea of, did anyone think that the end of colonialism would mean the end of capitalism or oppression, right? And maybe just to kind of end this off, it goes, when we talk about the issue of liberalism, right, or the bourgeois, bourgeois society, maybe what Andrew would say is an orthodox Marxist or socialist would have to defend that universalism, would have to defend modernity, when actually the issue of decolonization addresses that directly. And this is what you're talking about, kind of postmodernism. Is actually it's the turn of bourgeois society of modernism is white supremacy, and that is the deeper problem, right? And that's the politics, and maybe the new kind of politics that the left would have to address. So maybe for you, maybe just to clarify, sorry, that was a bit rambling, which is the deeper problem? Because either could be a distraction from each other. And I'd like to know who thinks what.
Thanks, Becca. Andrew, do you want to get started?
Yeah, all right. Okay. Is colonization a capitalist problem?
Or is capitalism a colonization problem?
Right.
Well, you can tell by how I framed the question, the answer I'm going to give you. So, right here. So for the specific types of colonial projects we've happened to be discussing in this session, yes, colonization is essentially the kind of a problem of capitalism. So you can't understand the colonial projects we've been talking about without understanding the kind of the economic motivations that go into things like, you know, the slave trade and cash copies. It's not the case for all forms of empire imperialism, right? So just for the sake of brevity and clarity, you know, I've kind of directed the things I spoke about to those European colonial projects that kind of collapsed in the mid-20th century. But if you looked at the very early years of like Spanish and Portuguese empire building, the very early years, they were governed by kind of, you know, a spirit of political aggrandizement and also by economic self-interest. They weren't strictly speaking capitalist, not in the first iterations. You could say similar things potentially for like the Ottoman Empire and also for Japanese imperialism. So that's my kind of like, you know, not very satisfying answer. My response is, yeah, it's largely enough, but not always.
Thanks. We keep going in order. James, if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be very satisfactory, but I think partly these are about how you, what level of abstraction you're talking in, I mean, to say, you know, the trouble with talking about capitalism is it's very thin conceptual thing, that because it's so broad, you know, like it's like a spanner that fits all nuts. You know, it's all capitalism from right, you know, from, you know, McDonald's to the Ukraine war or something like that, and it's harder to get your teeth into. And I do think it's quite an interesting moment. We should maybe reflect on this. Is why is it that the colonial struggle has become emblematic for so much? Especially since I'm thinking that myself that this is an historical moment that's over. So I'm kind of bemused, if you like, that we're trying to understand all about modern contemporary conflicts through the prism of this kind of mid-century subterranean war. But it's this thing that somehow has got like moral weight. In a way that, you know, like, so when I was growing up, it was the workers' struggle was essentially, and socialism was, and that's itself a limited point of view, but that was how we talked of it. Everything was the class struggle. Now everything is coloniality. And that I think is a kind of, because we're a bit embarrassed about pressing our own claims here in Britain. You know, it's like it just got more authority, and it's right. Actually, this has always been the case. You know, it's always been a weird. You know, the reason the Marxist category of wage slavery exists is because the Chartists, of whom the Marxists were a faction, were in a struggle with the anti-slavery society for the attention of mid-Victorian Europe. And they used to get up in meetings and say, we don't want to just fight against slavery, we want to fight against wage slavery in Britain. And the rather middle-class anti-slavery society would say, get out of Chartists. So there's an actual contest to try and, when people, the reason there is that category, wage slavery, is because 19th century proto-socialists were trying to make their problem live for people who were attentive to the liberation of slaves in the West Indies, but indifferent to the suffering of these white slaves in Yorkshire. Even as I'm saying that, it sounds freakish and weird. But I think it's intriguing. I mean, I'm not saying more than that. That it's that if you in the cinema, in drama, in fiction, if you want, like you kind of pick up quite quickly who the bad guys and the good guys are. You know, the bad guys are like these kind of white racists who race in, you know, with Ku Klux Klan hats and to lynch somebody, and you see the poor suffering peasants in the field, you know that they're going to be the good guys. And that's very much a reversal of my childhood, because it was kind of more or less the other way around when I was little. But that's the moral framework that we rest upon. Anti-colonialism seems to speak to goodness and freedom, and the workers' struggle looks kind of vaguely racist and a bit aggressive and skinheady and
That's promising.
sorry about that.
Thanks, James. Ralph, go ahead.
If I may take the place of the slightly vulgar Marxist here, that I would say the problem is a capitalism problem, because capitalism is an expression of the crisis in the modern project of freedom, which is what the advent of bourgeois society was meant to be. It was meant to be that, the freedom of each would be the precondition for the freedom of all, and that everyone in the world would be, free and equal, and there would be, an expression of brotherhood between humanity. Yet that isn't materialized fully. And I think when you sort of address the problem of capitalism, I think this is what my gripe is with decolonial theory, is that it seems to very prone to try to attack capitalism from a kind of particularist standpoint, when capitalism is a universal social form. So you have to find a way to address it in a kind of broader internationalist universal social form. You can't do it in a kind of particularist or sectarian or even national frame. And I know that's very easy to say, but harder to actualize in reality.
Thanks, Ralph. There was a question for him.
Yeah, thanks. So I don't know exactly how to ask that, but okay. A lot of the discussion, I was just thinking, everyone here should read Abdullah Öcalan. He's the Abdullah Öcalan. He's the ideological leader of the Kurdistan freedom movement. And when I was listening, I was thinking, I don't know if that's because we are in the UK, but I guess it's a little bit UK centered in a way that's like we have in mind like the British Empire, the coloniality of the ex-British colonies. And I was very happy when Ralph mentioned Palestine as an example of like ongoing, straightforward colonization. And I think Kurdistan is such an example as well. And there are probably other places that don't come to mind immediately. I think there still are. I mean, somehow I feel like it has been spoken about decolonizing, like armed decolonizing movements as a thing of the past, and also Marxism as a thing of the past, right? So, and all we have today is the curriculums. I don't know. So, okay, there's been some. You obviously mentioned, for example, the square occupation movement that is something with a fresh kind of energy, and yeah, the Black Lives Matter and all this stuff that is developing like critical thought on the present, and I'm wondering why haven't been contemporary armed movements, decolonizing movements, and their political theorists considered at all, because maybe they have, because they're still doing in a way an old-fashioned kind of decolonizing struggle, but in the present, with observation of the present politics and economic relations, localized economic relations, and geopolitics, in which there are so much, who sells guns to who and
who buys them from whom, and all these alliances and how which country positions themselves. Like they have to analyze all this stuff very well, and they do, and they write about it. And they've also questioned, for example, the left. I wouldn't agree with Andrew when he said that the history is kind of this burden or maybe an obstacle to like fresh movement. I mean, I would say that people can always learn from there through critique of it rather than just forgetting it. I guess that was my point. Yeah, why not consider contemporary? Because there have been, for example, I mentioned Adolf Hitler because after 2000s, there's such a thing as the new paradigm of the previously classical Marxist-Leninist Kurdish movement, turning it into something else, which at length discusses the modernity, for example, the notion of modernity, capitalist modernity versus democratic modernity. That's what we are supposed to strive for together. It's very transnational, although it's at the same time the national liberation struggle. So like a lot of answers to the stuff that you were discussing actually are right there. Yeah.
Thanks. Go ahead.
So, I mean, the question you raised is why not think about the armed struggles of the present? Why not? I mean, actually, that call is entirely consistent with the argument I made, which is that we shouldn't be primarily focused on things like the armed dramatic struggles of the past, right? So, yes, right? And I don't think that armed struggles are a thing of the past. Like, they definitely are not. There are, huge numbers of people engaged in armed struggle around the world who are kind of taking it very, very seriously. And are kind of, believing they're striving towards something better. I'm just trying to raise the point. In my engagements with a very particular type of leftist politics, I did spend a hell of a lot of time engaging with the histories of the armed struggles of the past without learning about exactly the kind of thing you just asked me. So, yeah, I agree.
Thanks, Andrew.
Quickly add something.
Go ahead, Ralph.
Just it reminded me of another example you could say of anti-colonial struggle in the present, which is Western Sahara and Morocco. And they, obviously, the Polisario Front is of the same kind of kidney as some of the Kurdish groups, like former Marxist-Leninists mixed with nationalism. And it's and also it's actually an example of an example that doesn't really get talked about much because it's Morocco against like Sahrawi people, and most people don't really find that attractive to engage with compared to say Israel Palestine because of its Jerusalem and all of that. I agree mainly with that, with your point.
James, you want to add something?
I'm not knowledgeable, and I'm ashamed because I've got the book and I haven't read it. And it's obviously a very depressing moment in the sense that just after the election in Turkey, what disaster that the opposition made of it, and that we're stuck with that regime. And that there plainly is this kind of, and I hate, where this goes because for years I resisted any kind of axis of evil kind of thing. But there is there plainly is this kind of an alliance between Putin and Erdogan, and maybe even including India as well. And I think we've got to get used to the fact, or somehow get the critical acumen to understand that there is a reactionary power in the world which is not entirely derived from the West, but it's and do we have the critical tools to address this emerging reaction? And I'm the only thing that I hope you're right, because all I can see so far is the strength of the reaction, not the opposition.
Thanks. I'm going to ask Barbara's question and add my own twist to it. So Barbara was asking two questions. To continue on one of the threads, which was the relation between decolonization, liberalism, and the left, and I'll add Marxism. So Barbara was asking, do we need leftism to motivate decolonization? Isn't liberalism enough? Is a leftist position on colonialism the same as a liberal position? I'll add to this the fact that liberalism considered some forms of colonialism as progressive and other forms of colonialism as not progressive, as regressive, and Marxism as well, right? From Adam Smith to Marx to someone like Kautsky, the colonization of North America was considered to be progressive by and large. And so is there a progressive form of colonialism? Was that like, is that conceivable still? What did it mean for Marx and for Adam Smith and for Kautsky to say that the colonization of North America was progressive? And if not, then does that mean that liberalism as well as Marxism, for these reasons at least, is obsolete? And so I'll open it up to either of you.
Look, I want to say this, and I might be suicidal because the colonialism always had a progressive aspect. Capitalism has a progressive aspect. It's not, you're not separating the world into evil and good. When you say, all of Britain is capitalist. The workers are capitalists, and capitalists are capitalists. It's a capitalist social system. Also, what's good here is going to come from within. British people can see through that, transcend it, go beyond it, qualify it for the rest. Colonialism was massively destructive. 9/10 of it is destructive. But in destroying all kinds of fixed societies where there was no particular path out, it created different paths out. So decolonization movement is the progressive side of colonialism. I mean to say that in Nkrumah's book, when he's writing the history of the revolution in Ghana, he's talking about the way that the urbanization of the working class was definitive in terms of the trajectory of the movement. Sometimes you think he's been a bit optimistic, but nonetheless, I think he's talking about a real thing. He's saying that colonialism organized us against colonialism. In the same way that Karl Marx talked about, capitalism has this tendency to organize working class people against capitalism. It provokes a reaction. Now, that might sound punish us so that we can fight back. But this is how history works. It's not. There's never like the good people are over here, the bad people are over here. It's the interaction that generates the conflict that generates the next stage out. That's all I got to say.
Thanks, James. Andrew, you want to?
Yeah, let me think. The idea of something being progressive, that's not. I think I agree with you. That's not a value judgment of whether or not something's good.
Right.
It's about the things that motivate the projects, and it's understanding its ability to kind of make change through time according to some more usually modernist template. So depending on your kind of tastes in your politics, you could certainly regard the Soviet Union as essentially being a project of empire and colonialism. Like if you kind of, come from kind of Czechoslovakia or Estonia, then certainly you might be more likely to think that was a project of empire building that regarded itself as progressive. In terms of whether or not you need decolonization to make socialism, which was the question that came up on the screen, you could not establish any true socialism without first kind of substantively achieving decolonization. But that doesn't mean that decolonization necessarily and automatically turns into socialism. It just doesn't. That just isn't how things work. So we had a great paper a few weeks ago here in university by Al Bashar that a few of you were at. And it was all about the idea that the language of decolonisation has been very effectively co-opted by the Hindu nationalist far right. So that's what I think.
Thanks, Andrew. Rolf?
History is a tragedy, not a morality tale. And that's, the first lesson you'll learn if you study history. Look, historically, colonialism, or the colonization of North America that you refer to, was progressive in the sense that it helped facilitate the basis of the world market and the cosmopolitan commercial society, which will in turn produce its grave diggers, the working class. So in that kind of dialectical sense, yeah, that Marxism believed colonialism was progressive in that sense. That would you say that in this mature capitalist world, is there a form of progressive colonialism? I mean, I know there's some Maoists who think that China's rule in Tibet was a form of progressive colonialism because of overthrowing, the Dalai Lama and the Buddhist caste system. But well, we'll see. We'll see about that one. But yeah, I mean, basically, there is a task at play which imperialism has brought upon us, which is that of socialism. Trying to overcome these contradictions of capitalism. And until we try to at least do it, who knows?
Thanks. And we'll have one last question from over there. And yes, because this will be the last question, if you can wrap your sort of final comments, concluding remarks within the answer to that last question. Thank you.
I didn't know there were going to be concluding remarks.
No, like if you just, however you want to just synthesize it.
Well, like two kind of questions about teaching, so maybe you can answer as well. I was going to ask firstly how your leftist politics, if at all, impacts your teaching and how. And secondly, what does decolonizing in the curriculum look like? What does that mean tangibly? Because I kind of feel like what happens is there's a reading list, you have like a Black academic, somebody indigenous, something like that. Everyone shows up to the seminar, no one's saying anything interesting. It's not like the students, it's not giving. So what does decolonizing the curriculum look like outside of these admin-y changes? What should the students coming out of these classes look like? How should they talk? What should they do? Do you know what I mean?
Thank you. Yeah.
What should the students look like and do? And what should they think? Again, this is going to be sincere answers sound good. It's not supposed. I think the students should think and do exactly what they want to, and that they should be doing things that some kind of template that's handed down to them by the people doing the teaching. That's the whole point, right? Is that if you're doing teaching and you're doing it passably well, you should be giving people the tools to go away and do their own thinking. And if the academy is working passably well through time, then the things that the next generation of people come up with should ideally be better than what you came up with. That's what I think. But then having said that, clearly writing a curriculum is a project of power. And that's not just a project of power when you think about colonialism and coloniality. It's a project of power because the people that are doing it are supposed to be people that are qualified. So, when I'm sitting there writing a curriculum, I am sort of thinking about how the students engaged with it last year, with things that they understood or didn't understand, things they found problematic, and that factors into how I design this game. I also kind of try and sit there as much as possible and identify the latent assumptions I have about what are core questions and what are kind of useful ways of thinking, and try to interrogate them and try and get myself outside the box a little bit. So that's the kind of substantive side where kind of decolonisation comes into kind of the teaching. And there was a first question. I forgot the first question. What was it?
How your leftist politics impacts your teaching, if at all.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, again, these are just matters of personal feeling and taste. So Victor's asked me if I'd join this panel. So I've come here and I've kind of given you my kind of hackneyed kind of slightly embarrassing narrative about the SWP, blah blah blah, revolutionary socialism. And a good number of my students happen to be in the room, because that's just how it's worked out. But I really do strongly believe that a lecture and a seminar is not a missionary event. Like, my job is not to convince people in the room that kind of revolutionary socialism is right. Like, if that was my job, I'd be doing something else. My job is to kind of show people kind of information about the world and ideas about the world that they can use to understand it better on their own terms. So I kind of I do believe pretty strongly that any student sitting in one of my lectures and seminars is free to have any political opinion about the world that they want to, so long as they can kind of show how they arrived at that opinion, and they can kind of defend it with reference to kind of empirical cases and kind of sound intellectual process. So yeah, my answer is teaching is not proselytizing, ideally. But it's going to be hard for me to sustain that idealistic position. Now we've got this event, isn't it?
James?
I think the important thing on any study is that the choice of subjects are important, but not that important. I mean, to say you look at anything, all roads in essence lead to Rome. It's the more you study, and it can be any human history, drama, tragedy. The further you go in, the more you get out. So I'm glad, we're in a very happy place that at last, Britain is a little bit more attentive to the fact there is a world, and that other people. And it's been a long time coming, but it is good that it's at least possible to start looking at other places. Maybe sometimes when we come to write the curricula, it looks a bit tokenistic, God forbid. That's we're idiots. What do we expect? It takes a long time to get there, and you should take the cue from it. Like, of course, they're idiots. So I'll ignore that and I'll just get on and do this, and you'll find out whether you've got a good teacher or not quite quickly, because a good teacher, if they think that you're going somewhere, will listen and be interested and encourage. A bad teacher will say, oh, don't do that. And I'm probably a terrible teacher, but in terms of I think that as much as we know, we've got to give it up, because we spent some time learning some stuff. It might be all rubbish, but you can decide. So we should give up whatever we've got and be as intelligent about it as we can. Personally, I never teach what I think, because if I did, my students would all hate me forever. And so I always try and teach like what the established view is. And the established view now is a bit more decolonized than it used to be. I'll teach that, because I feel that I've got responsibility. I'm their representative, not of me and mad biography who got me to this point. But I'm there for to put all of the culture, as much as I've got access to it, in front of anybody who is willing to pay attention to it. And that's an important responsibility, and we should take it seriously. And occasionally it can seem prescriptive because you can't study everything all at once. But I think the best teachers are the ones who know that There are many, many, many roads or paths to better understanding.
Thanks. Ralph, if you want to answer this or to have final remarks.
I'm not a teacher. I've never been a teacher, and I'm not sure I'll be much good at it. But I will say that I do agree that the object of education should be, at least in principle, teaching people how to think, not what to think. And as for the curriculum, at least in an ideal world, it would be to try to tell the story of humanity and how humanity developed from where it started to what we have now. And you can bring out all the accumulated cultural patrimony of humanity, whether it was in China, India, Western Europe, and so on and so forth. And you try to eke out sort of universal themes that could bind people, into a common conversation across ages, beyond like arbitrary social divisions that we live in. And then through that, people can engage and critique and then arrive at a better, more holistic understanding, enlightenment, and what the Greeks called paideia, deep education.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Last words, if you're interested in platypus in Cambridge, you can speak to Cameron or myself. There's issues of the platypus review on the table over there. They're free for you to take. One of them has James Hartfield in a panel we organized last year on what is Marxism for example. If you're interested in platypus in London, you should speak to Rebecca or Jay, who's over there, or Mateusz, who's at the front, or Max, who's over there, with everybody. Do talk to us, especially undergraduate students. This project was originally created by undergraduate students for undergraduate students. So do talk to us if you're interested. Some of us, at least, will probably go for a drink. There's a place close by. So do come with us to have a drink and keep talking. And that's it. Thank you very much.